In war, it is often said that the best defence is a good offence. However, sometimes you just want to hold ground and not let the enemy take it at all. Some of these defences are so good that the enemy just ignores them and finds a different route. So here are 5 defences so good that the enemy just went round them. Number 1. The Channel Islands. Operation Sea Lion was the Nazi plan to invade the British Isles. It was stumped when Germany lost the Battle of Britain. However, one part of the British Isles was taken and occupied for the duration of the war. The Channel Islands, consisting of Jersey, Guernsey and Alderney, were taken shortly after the fall of France. The British virtually abandoned the islands as they had no particular strategic value. The Germans fortified them and included them in the Atlantic Wall, a vast stretch of concrete defences all down the French Atlantic coast. Hitler ordered them to be made impregnable fortresses. This meant the islands were some of the strongest fortifications on the wall. Around 12% of the resources used for the construction of the Atlantic Wall went into the Channel Islands. Masses of tunnels were dug into the islands to house ammunition, men, equipment, tools, weapons and hospitals. They even built small railways to move stores and ammunition around quickly. There were machine gun nests, bunkers, pillboxes, towers, artillery guns, anti-aircraft guns, beach defences, minefields and armoured vehicles. All the defences were built by labourers brought in from various parts of occupied Europe and were not treated well by their captors. In 1943, a liberation of the islands was planned but never carried out. It was decided that they were so strongly defended, the Allies would probably lose more soldiers, sailors and airmen than the total number of islanders that would be liberated. To that end, the Allies launched D-Day on the 6th of June 1944 and completely ignored the Channel Islands. The whole of Europe was liberated from the Nazi regime while the Channel Islands remained under their control. The German defenders began to suffer as supply drops stopped and they were beginning to starve, but they didn't surrender. Almost a year later, on the 8th of May 1945, the German garrison stood down and the islanders were free once more. Number 2. The Maginot Line. Probably the most famous on this list, the Maginot Line was a huge network of trenches and bunkers that stretched the length of the French-German border. It was built after World War I as an insurance policy in case Germany ever decided to move west again for winter. The line consisted of well-entrenched and armoured artillery guns and mortars. Machine guns and minefields were there for anything that got really close. Underground there were whole hospitals, barracks and ammunition stores to keep vast amounts of men supplied for weeks. There were booby traps for invaders that managed to enter the defences and anti-tank ditches to stop vehicles getting close. Vast amounts of armour plating and concrete were used to protect against the biggest guns and bombs of the day. The defenders even had secret exits to escape if things got really bad. 3 miles in front of these were armoured observation posts to warn defenders of a coming attack. The German border was just over a mile away and every bridge en route was mined to prevent them crossing. Each road junction was wired up as well to impede a vehicle's progress. The French even designed each bunker so that it could be shot at by big guns from other bunkers to stop any Germans that crawled over them looking for an entrance or a weak point. And if anything did make it through the gauntlet, the French army themselves would be waiting to push them back again. The French Air Force would deal with any air assault or bombers, so only an idiot with millions of men to spare would attempt to attack the Maginot Line. In the book The Art of War, Sun Tzu says, "Fight the enemy where they aren't." Some people are puzzled by this notion because, well, it doesn't seem to make much sense, but others know what he means. In May 1940, the Germans decided that if they couldn't go through the Maginot Line, they'd go round it instead. The defences stopped at the Belgian border. Belgium had its own defences, but they weren't in the same league as the Maginot Line. So the German army blitzkrieged its way through Belgium and took the Maginot Line from the side and rear. Many of the bunkers actually held out and were still fighting when the armistice was signed on the 22nd of June 1940, and thus one of the longest and toughest defences of the modern world was overcome by stepping round the side. Number 3. The Golden Horn Chain. The Golden Horn is a river in Istanbul. Throughout the ages, Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was known, has been a desirable location and many empires have tried conquering it, with varying degrees of success. To that end, various defences have been implemented, and one of these was a chain across the Golden Horn River, which is mentioned in history as early as the 8th century AD. Fixed by fortified towers, the chain is thought to have consisted of metal links that joined to logs in the middle to allow it to float. Without the logs, the chain would sink to the bottom of the river and wouldn't be much of an obstacle to ships. Many tales tell of how several invaders attempted to ram the chain with their ships, but couldn't get up enough speed using only oars and sails, plus they're sailing against the current. Eventually, in 1453, Mehmet II decided to take Constantinople for himself, as it had been surrounded by his empire for years, but held on as a bastion of Christianity and a thorn in the side of Islam. He did actually try ramming the chain twice, but it refused to break. The towers that the chain were fixed to were defended by archers, soldiers, fixed gunboats, and Greek fire throwers. These were very early flamethrowers that the Byzantines used to burn enemy ships in naval battles. The story goes that he had wooden road laid on the land and covered in oil, and a series of carts were built that were large enough to put his ships on. He then got his ships out of the water, onto the carts, and dragged them using mules and men. Some accounts say that instead of carts it was just logs, but, to act as rollers. The legend says that he took 80 of his smaller ships over a 200-foot hill in Galata, and then slipped his boats back into the river and continued his attack. In May 1453, the wall was finally breached and the city fell. Several links of this chain still exist in various museums around Istanbul. However, they are in surprisingly good condition for pieces of metal that spent most of their life in water and then hundreds of years out of it. Number 4. Hannibal in Italy. Hannibal, no, not that one, this one, is a legend in military history. Most famous for taking elephants over the Alps into Italy, he was a master tactician and considered one of the greatest leaders of all time. His family name was Barca, and Barcelona is thought to be named after his family. He sought to crush the fledgling Roman Empire as it stood in the 3rd century BC. Having marched over the Alps and defeated the Roman army in various skirmishes, he doubled the size of his army by calling on Gallic tribes that hated the Romans as much as he did. After a harsh winter and many battles, his elephants were reduced from the original 37 to just 7. He didn't use them in battle after this, but used them to scare towns into submission. His strongest force was actually his cavalry. The Romans couldn't match their flexibility and offered great advantages in the open plains of Africa, but not so much in the mountainous regions of Italy. At the Battle of Cannae, in the year 216 BC, Hannibal took a force of around 50,000 troops and defeated the Roman army that had a strength anywhere up to 87,000. One of his generals is said to have urged him to march on Rome, which was just 250 miles away, and said that he could be eating in the capital within 4 days. Instead of attacking the city, he preferred to sack the countryside. He would split various towns off from the city of Rome, and saw himself as a liberator. He didn't seem to want to march directly on Rome, perhaps through fear of losing his cavalry against a heavily defended city. He spent something in the realm of 15 years marching around Italy, cutting off towns from Rome and freeing various Greek cultures from their Roman bosses, as he saw it. However, because he hadn't crushed Rome entirely, they were still dangerous. Eventually, the Romans realised that if they could cut off Hannibal's supply routes and keep whittling away at his army, his numbers would eventually dwindle. Finally, in around 202 BC, Hannibal's army lost to the Roman army fighting at the Battle of Zama back in Hannibal's native Africa. Rome would go on to crush Carthage and attempt to eliminate it from the history books, an act sometimes referred to as the Holocaust of the ancient world. Who knows what would have happened if Hannibal had marched on Rome directly in 216 BC? How different would history have been? Number 5. The Spartan If. Philip II was king of Macedonia and father of Alexander the Great. At the time of his reign, the country we now know as Greece wasn't a unified country, but a group of city-states that all fought each other. Philip managed to pacify most of the city-states either through political treaties or forceful invasion. Most of Greece had capitulated by the time he came to the ancient city-state of Sparta. Spartans were known for their toughness, their inability to surrender, and their liking for using as few words as possible when talking, particularly to outsiders. Spartans are perhaps most famous for their stand against the Persian army at Thermopylae in the year 480 BC. 300 Spartans stood at the front of a small Greek army numbering around 7,000 against hundreds of thousands of Persians. They lost the battle, but it took 3 days for the Persian army to defeat them. 150 years later, however, Sparta was a shadow of its once mighty self. The city hadn't adapted to changing times. Whereas Athens was thought to be filled with academics and the home of philosophy and democracy, Sparta seemed to be obsessed with fighting. The city of Sparta famously had no walls to protect it, and when people asked where the walls were, the kings of Sparta pointed to their men. They said the army were the walls, and the spear tips were the frontiers. In the mid to late 4th century BC, Philip II of Macedon sent Sparta a message that said something along the lines of, "Would you prefer me to enter your lands as a friend or a foe?" The Spartan reply was simply, "Neither." That was Philip's diplomatic attempt, and it was met with typical Spartan contempt. So he tried to be more forceful. He sent a message that said something along the lines of, "If I bring my army into your lands, I will burn your crops, kill your men, enslave your women and children, and flatten your city." The Spartan reply was simply the word, "if." With one word, the Spartans had basically said, "Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough." Unsurprisingly, Philip left Sparta alone after this and continued unifying Greece. His son, Alexander the Great, would go on to conquer lands in Africa and Central Asia, and even lands as far as India, but he too left the city of Sparta alone. Two of the greatest generals in history thought it better not to attack such a legendary army and would rather face war on 2 other continents than attack a city with no walls.